Well, over the course of the last few weeks, we've been looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan and really wanting to just take inventory of our lives and to assess what are the needs in our area and how are we responding in a way that truly reflects Jesus' love. And through that, we've also been wrestling through some of the internal dangers of self-justification and maybe motives for why we do what we do, and looking at the importance of anchoring ourselves in the gospel and understanding God's grace and love in such a way that it would compel us towards action. Last week we looked specifically at the observation. We see both the priest and the Levite, when they see the need, they turn by on the other side of the road. And we looked at how we can do that as well in our own ways and justify because of busyness or whatever for why it is that we aren't acting and responding to needs or leaving it to someone else. We saw just towards the tail end of last week's video that the Samaritan comes along and, moved by compassion, he sees and responds to the need. And so today we're going to look specifically at some of the details of what that response looked like, and then ask ourselves the question, what does it look like for us to be neighbors like this? Let's look to Luke's Gospel. Luke 10:31. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to a place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." So here we see this Samaritan, compelled by compassion, move towards response. And I want us to just look at what some of the implications of this response would have been. First, he goes to the man who's half beaten and dead. And obviously we've seen that this is a dangerous road already. And potentially the robbers were still waiting for someone to come and help him so that they could then rob the next person. But he goes and on this risky road, he risks his own safety for this individual, putting his needs above his own. We also see that in the fact that his journey is inconvenienced. All of a sudden now there's this disruption to what he think he had to do or where it is that he was going, and he now goes and he takes his own clothes and bandages up this man. He uses oil and then throws him on his animal so that then he's going to be walking by foot, and takes this man to the innkeeper. Now there's some implications here. We see financially he's covering for the guy, but then he says that I'm going to come back so that any more of a debt that this man accumulates, I'm going to make sure that he's covered so that he's not indebted to you. Now for us, we need to understand something culturally here, that there were no bankruptcy laws. So as this man would have been accumulating debt, if he were not covered, if his debt wasn't covered, then he would have been having to sell himself into slavery to the owner of the inn, or his family for that matter. And so here we see that the actions of this Samaritan protects the man, gets him out of physical harm, cares for him, and is committed to a lengthy process so that he doesn't have to go into slavery, but he has his freedom. It's really a beautiful picture of Jesus' love, isn't it? I remember one of the most moving experiences of my teenage years, even before I came to faith in Jesus, was my dad. He helped a guy start a roofing business. That's how he paid for his university, and there was a guy in Barrie at the time who was running one, and my dad helped him kind of learn some of the tricks of the trade. And there was this one guy in particular who really struggled with addiction, and he'd go missing in action, for days at a time. But in one particular instance, he went missing for longer, and we were a little concerned about where he could be. And a few nights later, after a few days away, my parents got a call from a payphone. This man had been beaten by people that he owed money to, and left for dead out in the bush. Honestly, by God's grace, he survived and was taken to a hospital where he had surgery and his mouth was wired shut. And the first people that this man thought to call was my family. Now, you gotta understand, at this time, my parents had 4 kids at home, and this is a guy who's been left for dead by some bad people in town. But the immediate response of my dad was to go to where he was, to pick him up, to bring him to our home. And I remember just seeing this guy so disfigured, and my mom scrambling to get on some soup or something that he'd be able to consume, and my dad being on the phone trying to coordinate and figure out some secure housing for this man. And for me, it was just such a clear picture of Jesus's heart in hospitality and loving and caring for someone in need. And obviously it wasn't safe for this man to stay with us for an extended period of time, but they weren't concerned about the immediate risk. They were willing to bring this man in to give him safety so that they could find refuge for him. And I was just so moved and impacted by that. And I think that is really reflective of the kind of response we need to have when we recognize those in need. And it doesn't always have to maybe be such a drastic story or a grand story. It can be both like that in a time of urgent need, but it can also be in the simple day-to-day rhythms of our lives with those who live in our areas, those who live in our neighborhoods, those who live right beside us. Jesus responds to the lawyer now. So he's turned it. He's told this parable to set up his final question, and the tables kind of turn here. He says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor? This gets to the heart of the question. Jesus tells the story to the man to ask a different question. Not who's my neighbor, but who proves to be a neighbor? Who's the one that proves to be a neighbor? And the lawyer can't even bring himself to say the name, because we know the Samaritans were despised. And he just says, the one who had compassion. And Jesus' response to him is to go and do likewise. To see the love of the Good Samaritan and what it means to be a neighbor, and for his followers to respond in this same kind of way. That our love needs to look like this, to be neighbors. And so when we hear Jesus saying, go and do likewise, what does that mean for our lives? So we just take the whole of this month, observing the needs and recognizing that they're very real all around us. And recognizing in our hearts as recipients of God's love and grace through His Son Jesus, that we ought to, in light of that, be compelled to action as we abide in Him. What does that mean for our lives in COVID? We can't be idle. We can't be stagnant. We can't turn away from need like the priest and the Levite. No, we need to make ourselves available. So what does this look like for us to be neighbors? How do we live out this calling? It may be something as simple as doing up little cards for your neighbors and making yourself available to do grocery shopping or lawn maintenance or anything that they may have need. It may be, waiting on your front yard or setting up a place there where you can actually sit and have your coffee or whatever, and try to find ways to break down walls where maybe relationships are hard to come by. If we all just drive into our homes and isolate away from the world, we're not going to be able to connect with the needs that exist all around us, the deep spiritual needs that exist in the households that are in our neighborhoods. So we need to be thinking intentionally about that. There's also, outside of our neighborhoods, there's also bigger needs in our community. Like, we know long-term care homes are suffering, people that have been shut in and away from family, sometimes neglected and sometimes just out of an inability with COVID measures to have any family visit them. Maybe there's a place you can identify where you know there's some people there. We could write a card or send a care package, start a pen pal or a relationship with someone who's shut in. I was talking to someone from the Lighthouse just a few weeks ago, and they said that housing is a critical need in this community. Maybe you have extra space in your home, or we could set up transitional housing. That may seem drastic to you, but honestly, we have families that are coming to our shelters that are transient, that are being moved from our community week over week. And maybe you're thinking, I've got space, or I've got the ability to house or take care of a family in need, even if it's for a short time or a short period of time. Or maybe you've had the burden for children, and recognizing that our foster system can sometimes be overloaded, and this is something that you've thought about it but have never taken initiative. Maybe that's something you need to be praying about. Is there ways that we can use our home and our lives and our family to invite others into so that we can care for them on an ongoing basis? The needs are both big and small, immediate and long-term. And I think that I'm confident that we have to be taking inventory and evaluating, asking God, how would He have us go and do likewise? What are these needs? And how, Jesus, do you want us to respond? It starts by abiding in Him, looking around and seeing and recognizing the needs around us, experiencing compassion that He produces in our hearts, and then moving forward and saying, we ought to meet this need. We ought to respond in love. As ambassadors of the gospel, Jesus says to us, go and do likewise. May it be so with us, Emmanuel Aurelia.